Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Group Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp. And again, today we have another special guest, author, best-selling author, Heather Hamilton. And she's joining us to discuss her book, Returning to Eden, a field guide for the spiritual journey. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad you can make it. One of the reasons why I asked you on the podcast, well, there's several reasons. I think we have some things in common. I really like the way that your book explains the biblical stories in a very unique way, and then I really resonate with some of your things that you went through. So, I mean,
Mhm.
we're going to get into some of that, but you had some kind of a mystical experience. You had a painful time, a faith crisis, and so many people go through that. I went through that myself. So, uh, we're going to get into that. But there's just a lot of connection points that you had with my journey and what I want to bring to my audience. And so,
Mhm.
I'm really glad that you could join us. So, why don't we get started and get into why did you decide to write this book, and what was your goal in writing this book?
Yeah. Okay. Well, as you kind of mentioned, which I don't know if you want to get into it right now or not, but yeah, I had a mystical experience, which was it was simultaneous with what could conventionally be called a nervous breakdown. It was like,
That's
uh,
what I call mine too.
yes, yeah. At first, it was a nervous breakdown, and in retrospect, it was my spiritual breakthrough.
Yeah,
But so yes, it was. Personally, a lot was crumbling for me internally, and then because of the experiences that I was having, just it obviously forced this theological deconstruction. I realized that my worldview didn't line up with reality. My theological worldview just wasn't jiving with what I knew was
yeah,
reality.
right.
Um, and
Cognitive dissonance, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure whether there was more cognitive dissonance when I was sort of like before all this, the theological stuff that you kind of have to
Right,
talk yourself into. But yeah, I was seeing the cognitive dissonance. Like these puzzle pieces don't fit together anymore.
right.
Um, and so when this was happening, we were my husband was the music director at this large influential megachurch, evangelical megachurch, and it was just our whole world. And so I was sorting a lot of this, new theological insights out privately, some publicly, but I got to a point where I felt like I loved all of these people, and there was no way to communicate about the deepest things I cared about anymore. Whereas before, we were kind of I was on the same page in a lot of my relationships, and then I felt very isolated and like there was this barrier to communication.
Right.
And so I started writing the book maybe, I think, like, about 3.5 years after the mystical experience, which kinda propelled all of that, and the primary reason why I knew I had to write it was I have 3 little kids who we're in the Bible Belt. A lot of the environments are really saturated with this one specific form of Christianity, this one particular narrative about it. And so I I ever since sort of like waking up through the mystical experience, I just felt this urgency in life, like not that I was thinking about death all the time, but it was like living knowing that you could die. It's like this time is
Yeah.
precious and I have one life. And so I would kind of think if I was ever not here, like I need my kids to understand the journey that I've
Sure.
been through and the way that I see it. So
Yeah.
um, I I wrote it in a way where I would feel like if I was ever not here and my kids could have this book, they would have a deep understanding of
Sure.
my journey and the way that I see things. But then I also wrote it, just because I wanted to communicate with people who didn't understand, and as you probably know, once you start, um, seeing things differently theologically, it elicits a lot of fear and projection from
Oh, yeah.
people,
Mhm.
and so, the communication barriers just felt really hard to
Right.
overcome in real time sometimes, and so it was sort of like, this is I want people who I so want people who don't understand to just understand where I'm coming from. So I
Right.
tried to anticipate all the different pushbacks, which just, reading your book that you're about to release, I could see the same sort of thing,
Right.
here's the objections that I'm
Right.
anticipating. Let me go ahead and address them.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's kinda like the way I felt too when I came out with my first book on
Mhm,
which was more like a memoir, like, here's my story. This is why I'm changing,
mhm.
and, uh, you still get pushback, of course, but at least you got something on record to say, "Okay, here's what's really going on."
Right.
Um, and you mentioned my book too. I forgot to say that's another reason why I wanted you on the podcast. We got the same publisher, Choir Publishing, which is working out
Yes.
really good for me, and I assume it's working out great for you too.
Yeah.
And so yeah, my book is Breaking Bad Faith, and it's going to be focused on some of the retributive narratives,
Mhm,
exposing those in evangelical Christianity, and then talking about a path of peace that really you know contradicts the retributive narratives and really is much more appealing because it's
mhm.
more historical
Yeah.
in my view. So um, but your book, very unique. I love the way you weave these stories. You've got lots of small chapters, and each
Mhm,
one is dealing with these stories, and you've done a great job of putting it all together, making, both deconstructing and rebuilding a faith, and then look a new way of looking at the Bible.
mhm,
But let's go back a little bit to you mentioned the emotional or faith crisis you had. Um, what was that moment like? What exactly happened to you that that caused you to have that crisis, but also you had an experience that you said was the most real you ever experienced in your life?
mhm. Yeah. Well, without sorry to be a little bit vague about like what led up to it, but it was a personal crisis where I just had sort of suddenly some major revelations about my life. There was uh, some unacknowledged and undealt with trauma that I had been carrying for most of my life that I woke up to and understood that that trauma had really been quite a catalyst for a lot of the decisions in my life. And so, kind of zooming out and seeing it from a 30,000-foot view, it essentially felt like I had not lived my own life, if that had
Yeah,
made
right,
sense. That there were
right.
just, you know,
Because you got quote saved or gotten in the church when you were like 7 years old, right?
yes, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, from a very young age, really immersed in that, and I mean, I think anyone coming out of evangelicalism who really, like, bought into it sincerely has a little bit of that maybe going on in terms of feeling like, "Oh, I didn't have a lot of agency in my life," or it was, all my decisions were through this filter of, like, "What does God want for my life?" and feeling like I had to do certain things or go in certain directions in my life that I maybe wouldn't have chosen for myself had I just been felt free to be like, what do I want to do? What do I want to feel passionate
Right,
about or whatever?
right.
Um, but essentially on a personal level, it was kind of this waking up to the fact that um, because of my personality and my life circumstances or the environments that I had been in, that my brain had essentially been programmed a certain way
Mhm. Yeah,
and
right.
which I felt like was me. And then I kind of realized that it wasn't. It was like I was just sort of unconsciously living out this script that was very predictable based on my temperament plus the environment. It was like, "Oh, you were gonna feel exactly like this. You were gonna make these kind of decisions." So anyway, all that to say is I sort of kinda quickly had, a nervous breakdown slash identity crisis that happened, like, within the course of a week where my nervous system really just imploded, and, for the first time in my life, it was like I was having back to back to back to back panic attacks that
Oh,
I
wow.
could not, couldn't get a grip on, and I had just, had our 3rd child, so it's like I had a 10-week-old, where I'm trying to, like, nurse, and we're not getting any
Mhm.
sleep, and I'm panicking all the time, and, so it just very quickly went from, like, this really well put together, Christian American, successful, like,
Right.
woman who has it all together to this swing into, yeah, just a really helpless, desperate place where I wasn't aware of any resources that were out there that could have helped me, and I mean, honestly, just feared that if I asked for help, that my only real option would be, like, to go to, like, a psychiatric hospital, and
Oh, wow.
this
Yeah.
just felt like
Right.
the worst case scenario because I had
Right.
just had a baby, and so I
Yeah.
knew, like, I you can't bring a baby there, you know?
Yeah. Right.
So, so anyway, I kept trying to just, strong arm myself into getting it together, and, yeah, I just really descended one night into this pit of crying out to God, and for the first time, like, just really knowing that there was nobody on the other end of the line, that I was it just it was like my God concept that I had carried with me for my whole life totally evaporated. Like, I
Right.
just
Right.
knew this is
This is
not.
not working. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not isn't only is not working, but, like, it's not real. Whatever
Mhm.
I think is supposed to be happening or whoever I think is supposed to be out, like, doesn't exist. And it was a moment in hell where I recognized, like, this is what hell was, and it felt like just my life was in danger, like, I just couldn't, not that I
So
wanted to die, but just, like, I can't live like this.
right. So very, very quickly, I remember, um, you had this encounter with this person, and you felt
Yeah.
love emanating from that person. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So when I had this moment where it was like nobody's coming to help me, I finally, told my husband, like, I need some help. I don't know what that means, but I think that we need to call 911. And so we did. And when the EMS team showed up, I opened the door and immediately recognized that the person standing across from me was a transgender person.
Mhm.
And this it was just completely unexpected for me. Like, again, we live in a really conservative area, very evangelical context, and so my orientation here, which I didn't even know that I felt like this until this moment, where I was desperate and needed help, and the person there to help me was someone who, up until that point, I felt like I'm the one who has the truth, who's
Yeah,
supposed to be
right.
helping people like you, you know?
Right. Yeah,
Um,
the us versus them mentality, and
yes.
she or he was a them. He or she was a them.
Yes,
Right.
yes. And so I recognize that, oh, I don't trust this person to help me because I've been trained to feel like they're lost, Like,
Right.
how can
Yeah,
someone who's lost help me, you know?
exactly.
But there was nothing else to do except for just, start word vomiting what was happening. And immediately it was like for the first time in this whole mess, someone saw me. And it was like, I had been trying to get my family and people around me to understand, like, the severity of the crisis that was happening internally. And they wanted to help, but I knew that they didn't understand what was
Yeah,
going on.
right.
And this person did, and it was like suddenly, like it was just like this bubble um of love. I don't know. I think that that sounds a little bit weird, but it was like just time fell away, and it felt like I was suspended in eternity with just me and this person, and it was the palpable essence of Christ was coming off of this
Right.
person.
Yeah, that's
And
amazing. I mean,
yeah.
what a shocker. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like totally flipping everything and your whole worldview, kinda,
Yes.
and then you
Yes.
experience love from someone that you would never expect to.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was an encounter with the other,
right.
and I have like, the opening chapter in my book, talks about Saint Francis having, like, a very
Mhm.
similar experience, of encountering the leper and, you know, up until that point, having this sort of resistance to embrace, the other or someone that he had judgment about or whatever, and having this like, having the defenses drop and this compassionate, vulnerable moment with this unexpected person, and then coming to realize that it was, like, Jesus Christ himself that he had for him, like, he, like, kissed the leper,
Yeah,
um,
right, right,
and that's exactly how I felt. Like,
right.
it wasn't like, "Oh, this person was really Christ-like to me." It was Christ. Like, the
Yeah,
the vertical orientation that I had to, like, God is up here and I'm down here, it was suddenly this horizontal orientation
yeah,
where I knew that Christ was in her, speaking through her, and I also knew that Christ had awakened in me. I recognized something in myself that had been there the whole time, but I had really been asleep to it.
right. No,
Um
that's excellent. I've often said that, people don't change. They don't unless something very painful or emotional happens in their life.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people can resonate with what you're saying, especially with deconstruction, because
Mhm.
usually something painful has to happen before people kind of wake up, or
Right.
they get spiritually abused, or they can't reconcile the cognitive dissonance anymore, and they want to address it, and something happens that goes, okay, I gotta deal with this, right? I can't
Yeah.
keep sweeping it under the rug.
Yeah.
But it also happens that you came into the church, and you grew up with it pretty much,
Mhm.
and so you don't really have a choice. You kind of like go into it, and everything is the table's already set, and you're just
Yeah.
showing up and
Yeah.
doing what you're supposed to do.
Right.
But then other people come into the church in their formative years when they have some kind of a life crisis, and that's actually what happened to me. I had a nervous breakdown in college, but I'd already had all these born again Christians witnessing to me, and my mother, and my family, and my youth group, and all this stuff. And so you have this, you go, well, heck, they say this is the answer, the key to everything. So I guess I'll
Mhm.
jump in. But then later, when I deconstructed, another faith crisis,
Mhm.
kind of similar to what you're talking about, happened to me, and that got me on the road to deconstruction. So their patterns are very similar with people's experiences, and I
Mhm.
love that your mystical experience. I think that's a great uh, lesson for all of us about how Christ can show up in the most unlikely places. Um, uh, what about the Bible? You've got a lot of chapters in your book about Bible stories, but how do you read the Bible now compared to when you were an evangelical?
Mhm. Well, when I was an evangelical, it was all literal. You've probably already, like, dissected this, before on your podcast, but it was, you're a sinner from the beginning. Um, the
Yep,
goal is to go to heaven, and
original sin, original depravity, that kind of stuff. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, all of that. And so, when I was a child, it was you have to pray this prayer sincerely. You have to believe that this is the cosmic arrangement sincerely. Jesus is your payment. You deserved this. You
yeah,
deserved to be tortured and nailed on a cross
right.
as a kid. and it's your fault that Jesus died and had to go through all of this. And so, uh, yeah, it was like this massive guilt and remorse that I had to believe that this was, my ticket into heaven, but also like it felt like I had to pay penance or something. It was just like, well, you have to give your life to God because this is what was done for you.
Yeah, you kind of feel like you owe
Yeah.
something. I mean, this amazing sacrifice that you actually deserve because you're such a terrible person
Yes, because you're
makes you
such a
feel
terrible
guilty, but
7-year-old. Yeah.
they keep saying, "Well, yeah, but now you're free in Christ, but you better, stay within these lines, and the
Mhm.
swimming lane is very narrow, and, you know, or else you could
Yeah.
fall away, or you could,
Yeah.
become a heretic or,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so there's always that fear, right, in the
Yeah.
background?
Yes. Yeah, so that was the my orientation towards it, and then, of course, it was sort of reinforced by, yeah, a worship environment that was really emotional, that really played on, emotions, and so, yeah, I just felt like there were so many times of just getting worked up very emotionally,
Oh, yeah, I remember
and
those.
yeah, and then right on the heels of it, making some, like, really life-altering decision, It was, oh, my heart's bleeding open or whatever, I'm so emotionally exhausted, and I'm gonna, like, dedicate my life to being a missionary,
Yes,
something like that,
yeah, yeah, right,
when I'm
exactly, yeah, I was just gonna say that, yeah, then you go,
yeah.
"Okay, I sign up for Africa."
Yes, yes, something like that, and so
Right,
it was and a lot of that was at a young age, and so I remember, like, as I grew as a teenager and getting into college and everything, really having these internal struggles about, like, "Oh, well, I'd like to get into filmmaking or what," but I promised God when I
yes,
was
right,
12 that I would
yeah,
go be an overseas missionary, and
right,
so there was, like,
yeah,
this struggle to
right, yep.
yeah, to rectify all that. But anyways,
The
so
Bible, what do
yeah,
we how do we view the Bible?
yeah, well, during my nervous breakdown, having that encounter in what I knew was hell, I knew that it was like a
Right,
psychological state. Um, the other thing that came to me was like, "Oh, I'm in the belly of the whale." Like, this is what the Jonah story is about
mhm,
when he
mhm,
talked about being swallowed into this darkness I knew where he was. And so sort of, um, I had to go get a lot of, like, therapy to get my head on straight, so I wasn't at that moment like, "I'm a deconstructing Christian now." I didn't
no,
even know
right,
what that
exactly,
was.
yeah,
But I just knew that that story wasn't literal. However, in my own personal awakening and transformation, the best way that I could find to describe it were these biblical metaphors. Where I was like, I was in the belly of the whale. This is
yeah,
where the transformation happens, or I feel like I am being crucified and buried. Like it, all this really strong symbolism felt like an accurate the closest thing I could get to explaining what was happening to me both spiritually and psychologically. So, the literalism quickly fell away, but I was still really, like, intrigued in I just felt like the stories had a deeper meaning. I
yeah,
felt like
uh-huh,
that they were mythological and symbolic, and up until that point, mythology had just meant, like, a lie, like it was a bad word, for someone to say, "Oh, the Adam and Eve story is a mythological story." To me, as an evangelical, that would have sounded like, "You're saying that this is fantasy, like someone just went and made it up like Cinderella or something like this." And what I was coming to understand is, no, that it was symbolic representations of psychological processes.
right,
And so, yeah, that's how I came to view the Bible. And then over the years, I sort of found confirmation of this. in, like, some academic texts. So, one person who was really influential for me was, Joseph Campbell, and I
Oh, yeah.
mentioned him in the book. I never heard myth explained in this context. But so anyway, so I came to understand mythology as, um, like, maps into the inner world, like, to help me locate the universal energies that were flowing through me, and also the patterns in my life. So, yeah, that's how I read it now through, like, a psychological and mythological lens.
Right, right. No, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, people are afraid of that word myth, and,
Mhm.
they, they just think, "Oh, you're gonna you're off the deep end and you're an
Mhm.
apostate because you believe some of the Bible was a myth." And it's like, "Okay,
Right. Yeah.
well." Right, uh, I think Marcus Borg has a lot of stuff to say on this as well as Joseph Campbell, but, there's just because it's not literal or it's mythological doesn't mean that there's something that not valuable in it.
Right.
Of course, it depends on the story, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
Right, so
even,
there are some things that are pretty ugly in there too, but
yeah.
there's a lot of things that are, valuable, if we look at them in a different lens and we don't, like, put ourselves in the, in errancy, swimming lane.
Yeah, well, and even that too, you come to understand that I was living by a myth before. The stuff that I thought was literal, or the cosmic arrangement that I felt like was the truth, was a myth that I was living by. And so, in that sense, that myth I don't think was accurate, but it still had the psychological power that myth does, when in my myth, God was this retributive being that it controlled everything that I did.
Yeah,
And
right.
so really a huge part of the awakening was waking up to the fact that I was living by a story that wasn't accurate, but that is the power of the myth. And
Right.
so really, like, my goal with the book was to get people to understand the power of mythology. And
Mhm.
as much as, like, we argue or try to talk people into, this is wrong or you've got it wrong or whatever, for me, the bottom line is like people aren't going to change, or they're not going to understand reality properly until they understand what myth is, and we come up with, like, a more accurate myth to live by.
Yeah, right, that makes sense.
Mhm.
So, one of the things that you address is, of course, evangelicalism is a fear-based faith, and at one point you realized the traditional view of hell, uh, it uses fear as an extremely effective recruitment tactic to
Mhm.
recruit people and to keep them in. But how did you finally outgrow this fear of hell and other fears that you had?
Mhm. Well, so my experience and what I recognized was hell was the growing out of it. Like, I knew that that's what it was. And so for me, like, the deconstruction process did not at all start with me, like, researching or seeking or reading other kinds of books or anything. It was that experience
Mhm.
of knowing what it was, which was, God, I'm trying to remember who said this quote, but essentially, like, you you deal with your fear of God when you deal with your fear of death, and that moment in hell was me dealing with my fear of death, where I
R
was
right,
looking at the end of my life,
right.
Um, and so that moment of terror, which propelled me, I into the trajectory that I needed to go into my life, I just knew that that was, like, the worst it was gonna get. Like, it
Yeah,
wasn't.
right, you've already gone through
Yeah, yeah,
hell,
yeah.
but you
Yeah.
found that it was temporary, it was
Yes.
a bridge, so to speak,
Yes.
to something glorious,
Yes.
and so you weren't afraid of it anymore. Is that
Yeah.
sound right? Yeah.
Yeah, I just it was almost like, and I'll give a little disclaimer, if anyone's listening with kids, I'm about to, like, shatter a myth, so press
Okay.
mute. But it was exactly like believing in Santa Claus and
Uh-huh.
then seeing your parents putting the gifts under the tree.
Yeah.
Like, it was I
Right.
just knew this isn't Santa's not real, you know?
Yeah.
So that experience of hell and understanding what it was and also understanding the function of it, like um it was a deeply personal revelation for me of like what I needed to heal in my life, what I had been asleep to, the unconscious patterns that I had been living out. It wasn't just this arbitrary place of punishment or whatever. It was really this reckoning with myself, judgment day, so to speak, as I was coming face to face with my own life,
Yeah.
um, how I had lived it up to that point and how I wanted to live it going forward, and that was in a more authentic way, like being true to this, genuine voice inside of me, which I would equate with Christ. Um, So yeah, that was how I overcame it. What I would say, like, was like consciously recognizing that I was in it and that I survived it. So what
Yeah.
was what was kind of amazing about it is like, oh, I went to hell and then I came back, So I knew that it wasn't this eternal
Yeah.
thing. It was a temporary psychological cocoon, or going back to Jonah, it's like, yes, he did get swallowed into the belly of the whale. And what happens in a belly? That's where the old is broken down. That energy is metabolized into something new. Um, and then this new creation is born out of it. So it's like all the old energy that had been used to sustain this really like false or inauthentic life, all that energy was broken down and then available to be reborn into this authentic way of living. I had all this new vital life energy like available to me.
Yeah. No, it's remarkable. There's different ways to overcome those fears, and you
Mhm.
described a very unique one that's uh, you know very effective, that you found a way to address these fears. I mean, for me, I'm more of a um, I don't know, research, historical,
Mhm.
right. I want to see the
Yeah.
facts.
Yeah.
And you're seem like you're more emotional. I mean, not emotional, but more experiential. Let's say
Yeah.
about
Well, I would
okay, I'm
say
gonna have
that
to
that came
experience it.
first,
Yeah,
and then I went and started doing the research to
right.
find things that mirrored back my actual real life
Yeah,
experience.
right. So
Yeah.
right. So it happens different with different people, is what
Mhm.
I'm trying to say. For me, I had to go into the facts,
Yeah.
the history, and then once that was settled in my mind, then the experiential came. It's like, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, this burden is lifting,
Yeah.
of thinking of the world and heaven versus hell, saved versus lost, us versus them, three quarters or 7/8 of humanity's going to hell,
Mhm.
depending on who does the math, and, it's just
Yeah.
there's this burden that just lifts. I was like, "Wait a minute," and then you realize, "Oh, actually, that fits so much more with the teachings of Jesus,"
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Especially when you realize that there's mistranslations of the word hell and eternal
Yes.
punishment in the New Testament, but
Yes.
yeah. So, very interesting. Another thing that I really like about your book is you bring out the concept. You call it a concept of becoming your true self, and I think you've
Mhm.
described how it happened to you. But how do you see that process working out, where people um, this become, through experiences, through study or whatever, deconstructing, they can become their true self as
Mhm.
opposed to their false self that was in the past. And how does that relate to some of Jesus' teachings? I mean, like on, you must be born again, or
Mhm.
to see the kingdom of God and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I use a few parables. Yeah, the true and false self motif is a theme that I pull throughout the whole book. Because to me, it it really is the message. So I mentioned, in my encounter with the transgender woman, recognizing Christ in her and recognizing Christ in me, and also knowing. that was there from the beginning. It was who I was before I was even born. And um really the spiritual journey was about waking up to that, understanding why I had gone to sleep to it in the first place, and that a lot of that had to do with just basic human development of, as infants, we come into the world in this sort of unitive consciousness. There's no judging, the rational brain hasn't come online yet. It hasn't developed. And so, when we see infants, this is why like we love children, is it's like it's just their pure authentic
Right.
essence. And so I recognize that as what was being described in the garden. It wasn't a literal thing. It was a symbolic state of unitive consciousness where there's oneness with the source, represented by God or whatever. But even as infants, there's oneness with the mother. Like the infant perceives that they are one with the mother. There's
Mhm.
no me and her or me and these other people. It's just a total presence to the environment. And then once the rational brain starts to develop, the function of that, because of evolution, is labeling and dividing. This is good, this is bad, these are my people, this is what all this is. And we start to label and break everything up. And so the symbolic representation of that to me was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, like once Eve symbolically bites into the fruit or eats the fruit, that to me represented the developmental transition into rational and dualistic thinking.
Mhm.
And so, where traditionally that has been framed as like this was a sinful disobedience against God, to me, I saw it as the inherent wisdom of life to move forward,
Right.
to embark on the journey of life. And so if we never obtain the knowledge of good and evil, which would represent the rational mind developing, then you don't have a life, That's that's a
Yep.
essential part of being human. So, but what happens when that kind of takes over and becomes the driving force of life is we go to sleep to our own souls. So in the story of the garden, you know, it actually only says that Adam was cast out of the garden and Eve, it doesn't say that she was cast out. So to me, Eve was like the feminine creative soul that is like the driving life force, and Adam represented like this dualistic mind, the one who labels all the animals and divides everything up. And so it's the mind or the false self that's like constructed this egoic personality, which is like your conception of who you are, what you're supposed to do, your temperament and personality traits. These are all parts of your psyche, but it's not the same thing as your soul. So
Mhm.
essentially the soul is like left back in the garden, and the mind can't comprehend that that the world could be any different than the way that it comprehends it. So yeah, so understanding that that was the spiritual journey was bringing the soul and the mind back into unity, like the two becoming one flesh and overcoming like this
Mhm.
dualistic split, um, felt like the task of the spiritual journey and what Christ was talking about. And so then I pull from some parables of Jesus later where he is like, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure buried out in the field. And so I'm like, I don't know how many times I've driven past fields. I've never been like, there must be a treasure out there,
Yeah, right.
you know? So
Right.
he's trying to awaken people to the fact that there is a treasure inside you that you have to go, you've lost awareness of it. And so the first step is even bringing people into this awareness that there is Christ or this authentic essence that's already in you from the beginning. So it's turning back in and starting to like dig down into this field. you know?
Right.
So, I started to see all the parables as pointing back towards that.
Right. So, how would you describe the false self? What is the characteristics of the false self in a person, and the characteristics of the true self?
Yeah. So the false self, which I think another word for that, which is fine, is the ego. It's it's our concept of ourselves,
Hmm.
where all I know myself to be are the roles that I play. It's
Hmm.
attachment to different identities, external identities.
Hmm.
I'm a mom, I'm a Christian, I'm a wife. All those roles are true, but it was until the point of awakening that was my essential identity. I didn't understand my own soul. I wasn't even aware of my own soul, which was something distinct that was playing these different roles, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. But the ego or false self, it's rooted in scarcity, it's rooted in tribalism and
Hmm.
fear
Yeah.
because it's just a concept that we hold of ourselves. It's not actually real. And the fear is that it's going to be annihilated. So that's ultimately it's rooted in our fear of death is, when I die, who I am or who I know myself to be is going to no longer exist. And that is terrifying for someone to think about. So that's why we hold so dearly onto this concept of like heaven and the afterlife, and I'm gonna, be with all my whatever. And this isn't a conversation about like the metaphysics of that, but really like what we're trying to hold on to is our ego. If I just do everything right, then I'll have like a sense of safety in the end.
Right.
Um, yeah, versus the true self for me is I kind of try to describe it as like um you realize that it is rooted in eternity. It is like your very life force. And so by relaxing the false self or as Jesus says, like dying to self, to me, that's like dying to this egoic personality that is trying to like control and hold on to everything with a death grip. When I can relax that personality and my addictions and my neuroticism that stem out of that neurotic personality, I realized that what came up and out of me was love, joy. Like when I could just be one with the present moment, all those fruits of the spirit that we hear about is what was inherently just flowing out of me.
Hmm.
And so I recognize like this is who I actually am. And a lot of my suffering has been forgetting that this is innately who I am. Are all these things. I am love, I am joy, I'm peace.
Yeah, it's a new paradigm on looking at yourself, right? It's just
Mhm.
like you kinda grow up with this way of looking at yourself, and if you're in conservative Christianity, it's very, uh, you know, defined, right?
Yes.
You have
Yeah.
to think of yourself and the world this very particular way. Even and what amazes me is even though there's talk of love and love for neighbor and enemy and so forth, at the end of the day, it's like you said, still people are caught up, they're insecure, there's fear, fear of hell, fear of judgment, fear of God, fear of leaders sometimes,
Mhm.
and there's a desire to be superior to
Mhm.
and that's the ego really wanting to
Yes.
take control everything so that you can feel better.
Yeah.
But then the true self, as you say in your book, it's really humanitarian love for everyone, enemies
Yes.
alike. But that's what matters most, and I think that's one of the things that one of my critiques of evangelicalism is they don't state that and really focus on that loving humanity as being what matters most.
Yeah.
It's all these other doctrines and theologies and
Yeah.
then it turns into retributive narratives about the world.
Yeah, which
And
are all very like you just said, the superiority aspect of ego.
yes,
The external Christian religion as we kind of see it, it's very egoic, you know? We're the best. This is the religion that's going to win in the end, and
yeah,
everyone else is gonna be cast into the lake of fire and wiped out by our King Jesus, you know? It's a very egoic mm,
yeah.
it's
There's
like a co
winners and losers,
yeah.
and we're on the winning team.
Yeah, it's a collective
And
manifestation of all
and
these little egos that want to
right.
win.
And not only are we on the winning team, but the people on the other team aren't worthy, and they're
Yep.
depraved. They've refused or rebelled, or they refuse Christ, and so they're expendable. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter, you know,
Yeah.
even though you're supposed to love them. But there's a love becomes very conditional.
Yes.
You know, you love people so you can bring them into the church, so you can convert them, so, you know,
Mhm.
and not love for love's sake. Um, so it kind of brings me to another concept that you bring out is began to see that Christ is in everyone, and
Mhm.
lots of other people, philosophers and theologians have talked about this. But I love the way you bring it out. You started to see Christ in everyone that you encountered. Like you saw that Christ was in that trans woman who who helped you, who actually
Mhm.
practically loved you in the here and now, and brought you comfort. And I just you have a chapter called Jesus in Disguise,
Mhm.
and that uh, share a little bit about what that means to you, and that helping anyone suffering is doing it for Christ, even if
Yeah.
they're irredeemable,
Yeah.
or supposedly irredeemable.
Yeah. I actually think that it became m even more than doing it for Christ, it was doing it to Christ. Like,
Uh-huh.
it was that absolute conviction that this that Christ was the like, the spirit that was animating everybody and everything. And, the caveat I'll put here is that there is psychological disfigurement. This is why I talk about the true and the false self, and, I make a distinction between it's not original sin, it's inevitable an inevitable sin, which means falling asleep to the soul or to the true self. So the actual Greek word for sin is hamartia, which means to miss the mark.
Right.
And it's fully identifying with this false concept of who we are. Um, and forgetting about the true self. So it was anytime I would encounter someone, a quote unquote enemy or whatever, it was this absolute conviction that Christ was there, you know, asleep in the tomb, if you will.
Hmm.
And because of the traumas of our life and, you know, the Buddhists, life is suffering, like there's just this inevitable trauma and suffering in our environment where we have to develop the false self as a coping mechanism to drive us forward. So a
Hmm.
metaphor I use is like a seed and a shell, and what actually grows off the tree is this embryo, which then a hard shell forms over it so that the embryo can actually fall from the tree and make its own way to fulfilling its own destiny, by eventually becoming a tree, but it has to like form this hard shell to navigate through the environment and through the brutal parts of nature. And that's essentially like what happens to all of us psychologically is, the false self kind of being this protective shell that we live in that's carrying this little embryo or this generative life force or Christ inside of us.
Right.
And so I began to just see everybody like it to on some on their own journey, you know, to some degree of in that process, you know? So for a lot of it where it's like, someone's acting totally neurotic or harmful or whatever, I began to see it as this giant coping mechanism,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
which didn't which wasn't an excuse for really harmful or malicious behavior, but you stop judging it.
Hmm.
Not to say, like, I don't need protection or we don't need to, like,
Right.
protect these people or get them away or whatever. It's like it's not that, but it's just making this moral delineation in my mind that, like, "Oh, this is an evil person," or "This is a bad person," or whatever, and I began to understand how a person got from, you know, infancy, this innocence in infancy to this really destructive behavior. I began
Right.
to see it as trauma, to see it as psychological coping mechanisms and all of this stuff. And really like what ends up healing people is is seeing the Christ in them. It's seeing this image of God in them. And that wasn't a metaphor for me. It was the reality.
Hmm.
And so it was beginning um to recognize the divine in other people and to speak to that part of them. And so I would find when I would do this, not all the time, but sometimes it was like when I mirrored that to people, they recognized themselves, you know? When
Yeah.
you treat people with absolute like dignity
Right.
and conviction that they are precious and, mysterious and magnificent and like the way that I had been treated by the trans woman, it called Christ forward in me. It was like, "Oh, it's risen now," you know?
Yeah.
And
I love. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
well, yeah, I just saw the potential for that, to happen, and I recognized that that is the way that a lot of, like, mystics and saints and, all sorts of other people throughout history had seen people. So in that chapter about, Jesus in disguise, that's exactly how Mother Teresa saw people. It was
Right.
this conviction of, like, "Oh, here's this person with here's Jesus with gangrene, like, I must help him," you
Right.
know? So
Yeah, no, it's yeah, I love the way you describe that, and in my book, Breaking Bad Faith, I talk about the exact same thing with
mhm,
different terms, and it's what you're describing is the restorative way of looking at humanity
mhm,
instead of a retributive way. The retributive way is you've sinned, you need to be punished. You know, someone has to be punished. Jesus has to be punished so you can be forgiven. And then
mhm,
if you don't toe the line, you're going to be judged and you're going to go to hell, and you're not worth anything in the sight of God, right? And until something happens, it's all very conditional, but it all drives back to retribution.
mhm,
You solve the world's problems by holding people accountable through punishment,
mhm,
right? um, and not looking at them as looking at people who are lost their way and doing evil things or wrong things, looking at them with an eye that like you said, these people are human beings that have lost their way,
mhm.
and there's a reason why they're acting out this way,
Yeah,
right? They
yeah,
haven't found their true self. They're caught in this, cycle. But when you try to reach them the restorative way, which is what I would call what you just described, so, you that's the hope for actually solving these society's problems, is
yeah,
when people restoratively approach people and draw them into like becoming their true self and leaving behind whatever wrongdoing they're doing.
yeah.
So I love the way you describe it in the book and what you just said. That's beautiful.
Yeah. I think a really practical example of what you're describing, I don't talk about this in the book, but there's, this organization called, I think it's called the Compassion Prison Project,
Hmm.
and they do some amazing work, and, like, as we're talking about, like, awakening to the true self, it sounds like this delightful experience, and in reality, it's really, like, a grief-stricken process, because to awaken to the true self is to acknowledge everything that's happened to you in your life and going back and naming it, acknowledging it, and then nurturing the parts of yourself that were neglected through those difficult things. And so, in the Compassion Prison Project, what they do is they go into prisons and, they're working with people who have committed atrocious crime, like murder, like
Yeah.
people who are lifers, in prison for the things that they've done. But it's this acknowledgement that, like, the true self cannot come forward in an environment of shame. And
Mhm.
so what happens is these inmates are given the, um, the chance to learn about adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma, and to understand the science of, like, if you have X amount of adverse childhood experiences, like, your brain is going to be wired in such a way that makes you way it puts you at so much more risk for
Right.
mental illness, addiction,
Yeah.
illicit behavior, all
Mhm.
this kind of stuff. And so it's amazing to see some of these inmates be able to go, like, how did I get from A to Z? What in my life made me feel like it was it was acceptable to take the life of another person,
Right.
I take responsibility for what I did, but
Mhm.
I also need to go acknowledge the fact that, like, my father left, or I experienced this violence growing up at home and I was so terrified. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And being able to have compassion for the inner child, or the true self, or the essence that was suffering in those conditions and had no help, you know?
Right. No, I go into some of those examples in my book, a different way of looking at prisons,
Mhm.
right? Because, we tend to think of prisons as a place where you hold someone accountable by they serve a prison sentence,
Mhm.
and then they're at only until they go through that sentence, can they be considered, all right, back to normal or something, hopefully. But of
Right.
course, the recidivism rate is very high in our country in American
Mhm.
prisons, so the system isn't working,
Right.
right? But what you just described, there are on that project, and I mentioned some other ones in my book where people are starting to look at punitive measures differently and say these just don't work. We need
Yeah.
to, and they're finding that, like for example, in Norway, they have a very different prison system. I mean,
Mhm.
they basically rehabilitate people,
Yeah.
and they treat them with dignity and respect, and even though they might have done terrible things, but they're focusing on you know this person is lost, and we need to help them come back,
Yeah.
and 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 it costs more to do that. So no
Yeah.
one wants to do it. You can't make as much money, but on the other hand, you save money in the long run because you don't have the crime rate goes down
Right.
because people you're being truly rehabilitated and restored to
Yeah.
society. So it's
Yeah.
it's it's fascinating, but I really hope people start to get a vision for this because it's really important because the
Yeah.
way we're doing it now is just not working.
Yeah. Well, and part of that is revising the myth, because, in contemporary Christianity, it's like, yeah, of course you're a criminal. Like, you're scum to begin with,
Yeah.
and so there's really no hope from you for there's no
Right.
hope for you for
Right.
rehabilitation. It's
Yeah.
just what you've
Yeah.
done is unforgivable, and that's
Right.
it.
Well, then Christians will say, well, yeah, they just have to accept Christ. So they have these programs in prison to get them to try to buy into these myths about the way the world works. And they think, oh, that's the problem, the issue for everything. That's the solution for everything.
Yeah.
But you're just getting people to buy into actually a retributive narrative about what God is like.
Yeah.
Uh, Right. So, very interesting. We've had a great conversation. We're running out of time. I had several questions I never got to, but thank you so much for joining us, Heather. For people who are interested in your book, obviously you can go on Amazon and find it, but you also have a website. Is it returningtoeden.com?
Yes, returningtoeden.com.
Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
you can I have a you can get to, purchase the book through, the links through my website as well. I do a monthly newsletter called Unorthodox, where you can sign up to just basically get what I'm thinking about each month, and, I'll probably put this podcast in the newsletter, where
Right.
you can hear me, and then, yeah, on social media, I'm on Instagram as Heather Hamilton 1, the number 1, or on Facebook as Heather Hamilton Author.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I really like the way you've, done your social media and your endorsements. I mean, you did a really good job with, putting graphics to your endorsements.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm gonna copy it if you don't mind.
Please copy it. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, okay, and then the other thing is, I'm gonna meet you in a few days because we're both going to the Awaken conference that's put on by
Yes.
our publisher, Choir Publishing. It's, at the I think it's the Spiro Day Church, does that sound
Yeah.
right?
Yes, in
In
Nashville.
Nashville, Tennessee. So if you're questioning your faith and you live in Nashville, there's a safe haven for you, June 9th and 10th at the Spiro Day Church. So, Heather, again, it's a pleasure that you could come on the Spiritual Brew Pub with us. It's early in the morning for me, so I was drinking my
Mhm.
coffee this time. That was my
Yep.
brew of choice, but
Yeah. I'm with you in
some
solidarity, even
oh,
though
there
I'm
you
3
go.
hours ahead. I'm still drinking it.
I don't think you've taken a sip this whole time. Maybe you haven't. I just missed it. But so, folks, that's it for the Spiritual Brew Pub this episode. And go check out Heather's book and Heather's content. And I hope it brings you a lot of blessing and a breakthrough in your spiritual journey. So until next time, enjoy responsibly.